Hey there, this is Mr. Wistar, and this lesson is going to cover how to create GUI apps in Java by using the Swing library. We'll talk about what Swing is, and we'll talk about some of the most basic classes that are part of the Swing library. We can't possibly cover the whole Swing library because it's got dozens of classes in it, but this will at least give you an introduction, and if you're curious and you want to learn more, you can take a look in the API. We'll talk about how to make buttons, and then we'll also talk about how to make them clickable so that they do things when the user actually clicks on them. So what is Swing? Well, it's a whole collection of classes that Java created in some of the later versions to allow programmers to create more sort of polished, professional-looking graphical applications like the ones that you're used to seeing on your computer. So it contains things like buttons, scroll bars, menus, text, checkboxes, anything that you might expect to see in a program that you use. You can probably find a Swing class in order to let you do that. They're all located in this library called javax.swing, so you're going to be importing that into almost every Swing app that you write. And you can tell which ones are the Swing classes when you look in the documentation because they all begin with the letter J. So JFrame, JButton, JLabel, those are all Swing classes. In order to begin with, if you're going to make a Swing application, the first thing you need to start with is a JFrame, and that is literally the application. In order to create your application, there's a couple of steps that you have to go through in order for it to render properly. Once you've created your JFrame, you should add all of the components that it's going to contain. Then you need to resize it to the correct size. You have to set the default close operation. And what that means is that you're just going to tell Java what to do when the user closes the window by clicking on the red button or the X. If you don't do that, then your application becomes impossible to quit. And that's kind of frustrating for the user. So then the last thing you want to do, and you should really do this last, is you call setVisible in order to make it actually appear on the screen. Let's see what that looks like. So here's my JFrame demo class, and I've done just exactly that, those steps that I covered in that slide. So when I run it, granted it's not the most exciting program in the world, but the title that I passed in the constructor does show up at the top of the screen, and it is full of nothing. We're going to fix that. We're going to fix that right now, because we're going to talk about the JButton class. JButton allows you, just like it sounds, to create clickable buttons, and you can put text on those buttons by passing those strings to the constructor for the button class. You're going to create your buttons, you're going to add them to the JFrame or the JPanel that you want to contain them, and if you want to make them clickable, which most of the time you do, you're going to eventually add something called an action listener, which we'll talk about at the end of this lesson. But let's see what that looks like. So here's my same program, but this time I've created a JButton object. And then what I've done is I've added it to my JFrame. So when I run that, you will see here, now I have a big button. Notice the text on the button matches the text of my constructor. Also notice that it doesn't do anything right now because I haven't told it what to do, and it fills up the whole screen. You're going to see when we talk about layout managers that Java is kind of dumb when it comes to how it arranges things on your screen. It's going to choose the easiest possible way to do that. And in the case of JFrame with one object in it, whatever that object is going to fill the whole screen. But we'll see much more complex ways of arranging things later on. Once you start getting into more sophisticated applications, you end up having more than one object. And when it's time to start putting those objects together, you need to arrange them. And in order to do that, you have to use something called a JPanel, which is really just kind of like a container that you can put multiple objects into. It turns out you can only add one thing to a JFrame object at a time. So what you're going to end up doing is kind of building up like a hierarchy of objects. You can even take your JPanel and you can divide it up into JPanels that are inside of it. So what you're going to do is take all of the fundamental objects that are part of your application, like JButtons, JLabels, things like that. And you're going to kind of group them into little clusters of JPanel objects. And then you can take those JPanels and put them inside of larger JPanels until eventually you end up with sort of one uber JPanel that contains everything. and that's what you add to your JFrame. So once you start getting into these kind of more complicated object arrangements, you're going to eventually want to start using layout managers, which allow you to control how the JPanel arranges things, which we'll take a look at in a minute. But here's an example of using a JPanel. Now I've got a JButton and a JLabel. I can't add them both to my JFrame because a JFrame can only have one thing at a time. So I have to create a JPanel and add them both to the panel. And then I can take that panel and add it to my JFrame. And when I do that, I end up with something like this. So here's my button, here's my JLabel. Notice that they just came in the order that I added them because I haven't told my JPanel how to arrange things with a layout manager. And so what it's using right now is just kind of like first come, first serve. Whatever gets added first gets put in my app first. It's not really attractive, and we're going to take a look at ways of controlling that layout a little bit better. In order to do that, we have to use something called a layout manager, which is really just like a rule that your JPanel is going to use for how to put things, how to arrange things on the screen. There's a lot of different layout managers. We'll look at some of them in a minute. But the way that you tell Java what layout manager to use for a JPanel is to call a method called setLayout. Usually what you do is you just say panel.setLayout, and then in parentheses you instantiate whatever layout manager you want to use. So you would say new flow layout or new grid layout, whichever one you want to use. And you can change it later if you want to. If you don't specify a layout manager, like in the example we just looked at, you get something called flow layout, which is sort of like no layout managing at all, because it just adds things to the JPanel in the order that you call them in your code. And there are other layout managers which are much more useful. So we talked about flow layout, but there's border layout, which divides up the container into 5 basic regions: north, east, south, west, and center. And you can tell each object which part of the panel you want it to go into when you add it. There's grid layout, which allows you to specify a two-dimensional grid for the JPanel, and then it will just put each item into the appropriate box in your grid in the order that you add them. So if you say new grid layout parentheses 3, 3, you can create a tic-tac-toe board. And then the super advanced layout manager is something called grid bag layout, and that will literally give you total control over the exact positioning of all of the items in your panel. That's the good news. The bad news is it's pretty insanely complicated, so you should study it very carefully. It's really sort of for, advanced swing applications. Let's take a look at an example of using a layout manager. So this is the same program, but I've decided to use border layout in order to arrange the things on my screen. So I said panel.setLayout, new border layout. And then when I called add this time, notice the last time I just used add. This time when I call add, I'm going to pass it a second parameter, which is a constant of the border layout class, which tells Java which part of my panel, which region I want to put each object in. So I took the first button, or the first object, and I put it in the center. I took the second object and put it in north. And when I do that, I end up with something like this. So now we have the label on the top, and we have the button in the middle. It looks like it's in the bottom part of the screen, but that's only because we never put anything in south, and we didn't put anything in east or west. So whatever's in the center part of a border layout kind of gets to muscle in and take control of all the other regions if they're empty. But the thing we put in north did end up on the top of our panel, which is what we wanted. Alright, last but not least, let's talk about how to make our buttons clickable, because if you don't have clickable buttons, they're not really very useful. In order to do that, we're going to use an interface called Action Listener. This is the third listener we've looked at after Mouse Listener and Key Listener. And one of the big differences here is that we're going to attach our Action Listener object that we create to the button itself, instead of attaching it to the entire application or to the panel. The easiest way to do this is to create an inner class which implements Action Listener, and then attach it to the button itself. It's a good idea to use inner classes because you might want to make different action listeners for the different buttons in your program, which is only possible if you have separate inner classes. It's not possible if your program implements Action Listener. So the way that Action Listener works is it's got a method in it called Action Performed, which is kind of like those mouse pressed or key pressed methods. And just like those methods, Action Performed contains as its parameter an object of type Action Event. I would encourage you to take a look in the API to see how that works. But it's got a bunch of methods in it. The one that you're probably going to want is called getActionCommand, because when you call getActionCommand, it'll actually return the text of the button, which can be useful if you want to know which button you clicked on or figure out what to do with it. And we can see an example of that right now. So in order to get this to work, I've had to make some changes which are worth pointing out. One is that in case I haven't said this already, make sure that you've also imported java.awt.star, and especially now java.awt.event.star, so we're doing event handling. But I've had to take all the components of my program and make them into class variables so that I can access them from my inner class. If they're just in run, then they're local variables and you can't touch them. Okay, so in my button, I called the addActionListener method, and I instantiated an object of my inner class. Inside that inner class, which is a private class which implements Action Listener, I've got my Action Performed event, or method, which takes this action event as its parameter. So we'll just make this simple. I'm going to call getActionCommand and assign it to a string, and then I'm going to use that string to change the text of my JLabel. So let's see what happens when that runs. So now when I click my button, it changes my text to match the text of my button. And I could have done whatever I wanted to inside Action Performed. But the important thing to remember there is that you attach the Action Listener to the button itself, which actually makes programming with Swing in some ways a lot easier because you don't have to figure out what got clicked if you use different inner classes for your different buttons. Okay, that's a lot of stuff, and it's really just scratching the surface, but it's enough to get you started. We talked about, sort of in increasing order of fundamentalness. We talked about JButtons, which you can put inside JPanels, which you can put inside JFrames. And all of that together makes a Swing app. You can organize the contents of your JPanel using a layout manager, and you can make your buttons clickable by using Action Listener. All right, you're all set.